Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited to share this program with you today. My name is Bethany Tabor. I am the Senior Program Officer for the New Mexico Humanities Council. The NMHC is an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we are also a statewide nonprofit organization. We serve the communities of New Mexico through cultural work by doing council-conducted programs such as this one, and also granting financial awards to smaller organizations around the state. I would like to thank our fearless leadership of the Humanities Council, Brandon Johnson, our Executive Director, and Michelle Quisenberry, our Deputy Director. I would like to thank the Albuquerque Museum for preparing their beautiful space for us today. I would like to thank Gregorio Perez, who is videotaping and running the production for us. And of course, I would like to thank our speakers, Steve Morgan, Doug Hulmes, Adam Lindquist, and Heather Provencio, and Henry Provencio. They've worked for months to craft a really great program for you all today, and I'm really excited. Some of you may know, some of you may not know that we're in a challenging situation with federal policy decisions that are affecting our ability to bring humanities cultural programs to the public. And if you have any questions about what's going on with that, the humanities staff is here to answer those questions after the program. But it really means a lot for you all to support us today, and we're just so glad that you can be here, and it's going to be great to engage in dialogue and conversation and celebrating our history. So thank you so much for being here, and with that, I'll hand it over to our moderator, Heather Provencio.
Thank you, Bethany. Good afternoon, everyone. It's been just a few short years since I retired from a 38-year career as a conservationist with the U.S. Forest Service. Today, I am super excited to be face-to-face with three of the leading conservationists in American history. I worked in my career within the policies, the ethics, the philosophies that these gentlemen laid out so very long ago. So very excited today. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce them one by one. And first we have John Muir. Thank you, John. And President Theodore Roosevelt. And last but not least, Aldo Leopold. So today we're going to focus on the conservation and preservation efforts of these gentlemen. They did many other things, but that will be our focus today. I'm going to start by asking a handful of questions, and then they're going to have the opportunity to ask questions of one another. And then we'll spend the last several minutes asking the audience any questions they might have for our panel members. So please hold your questions. With that, let's get started, gentlemen. So my first question for you is, Mr. Muir, we'll start with you. In your formative years, what were some of the things that shaped you as a preservationist?
Well, it is truly an honor to come here today, for I understand that all of you enjoy nature, or should. This is a glorious place around Albuquerque, and it is truly an honor for me to come here. I have to say that I was an immigrant that came from Scotland, and Scotland was a beautiful country, I have to say. I grew up close to the North Sea, and it was there, along the coast of the North Sea, that I found true escape from the drudgeries of school. For you see, in Scotland in those days, they believed we should memorize our lessons. And if we did not have our lessons memorized by heart, we were soundly thrashed. For you see, in Scotland in those days, they believed that there was a clear connection between the retention of the mind and the excitement of the flesh. And sadly, it was the same at home. For you see, my father was a Calvinist minister and believed that we should memorize the Bible. So by the age of 11, I had the entire New Testament and 2/3 of the Old Testament memorized by heart. And he also believed that I had likely sinned during the day. Well, I was a boy growing up in Scotland, fending off the British. And at home, he would say, "John, you've been up to no good. I can tell by the scruffs on your face. Bend over." And so on a daily basis, I suffered severe beatings. So it was nature where I found true escape. On the castle ruins of the Dunbar Castle and out along the coast. One day I came home from school and Father said, "John, you do not have to memorize the Bible tonight, for I'm taking you and your brother and sister and we're leaving for Wisconsin in America in the morn." Wisconsin. I had read about Wisconsin, where it was a wilderness. And we arrived in a place called Milwaukee. Are any of you from Milwaukee? You are? Well, it wasn't much of a town when I was there. And there, my father bought a wagon, and we were forced to walk behind it because all of our clothing and materials were in the wagon. And we walked for 2 weeks out into the wilderness of Wisconsin to a place near Portage. And there my father purchased a farm. We called it Fountain Hills. And so we were assigned to cut down the trees and plow the field and build a cabin so that after 3 months, my mother and younger brothers and sisters could arrive before the cold Wisconsin winters. After 7 years, the ground gave out, so we moved to a second farm. We called it Hickory Hill, as there was no living water, and so a well 90 feet deep had to be dug. And John, my father, said, "You will do the work." So with the mason's chisel and hammer, I knelt in a space 3 feet in diameter and wearily chipped for weeks and months. They would pull me out at lunch and feed me, and then I'd be lowered down into the darkness again. One day, when the dreary bore was about 90 feet deep, I suddenly succumbed to deadly choke damp, carbonic acid gas that had gathered in the well during the night. When Father saw that I was not gathering the chips as usual, he called down, "John, what's keeping you so still?" To which he got no reply. But just as I was about to go unconscious, I happened to glance up and see the branch of a bur oak tree hanging out over the well. And to Father's calling, I feebly responded, "Take me out." But when he began to raise the bucket, he found that I was not in it. And he called down, "Get in the bucket! Get in the bucket and hold on." Somehow I managed to get an arm and leg in the bucket, and I was brought out, violently gasping for air. But I do remember this. The horror was that the deeper I was immersed in the invisible poison, the less capable I was to take willing measures to escape from it. And so I find the vast majority of humanity so immersed in your silly jobs of town building and job getting and studying the spirits in heaven that you cannot see the heaven that God has created all around us in nature. And so I want to yell to you, get in the bucket and hold on, for unless we are able to arouse ourselves, our forests and national parks will be ruined and diminished from every degree. So we have to take care of our land. We have to take care of nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muir. President Roosevelt, can you share some events in your early life that shaped you as a conservationist?
Well, I certainly had an issue with Milwaukee at one point. I was shocked there, but we won't even talk about that. You know, if we're going to speak about early influences, of course, mine was a little different than yours. Thank goodness, I might add. You know, I was born in a place called New York City. And the wilderness was the place that I found that I could actually get air. I needed it for my lungs. It was the place that gave me energy. It gave me the ability to be a precocious child when I was outside. You see, I was born with a disease, a breathing disease. The disease was called asthma, and I felt as if I had an elephant standing on my chest. Every time I had to breathe, I had to fight for every single morsel of air. And my parents brought in the physicians of the day, and they listened to my lungs, and they said, "Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt, I have terrible news. Poor Theodore cannot be cured. We can certainly comfort him, but I believe that that poor young boy will not make it any older than 4 years old. Now, my parents brought in different physicians, and they all gave the same exact diagnosis. And one of them said, now, when does Roosevelt or young Theodore seem to get his asthma attacks? Well, it always seemed to be just before bed. So the first doctor said, Mrs. Roosevelt, this is very easy to cure. All you need to do is brew up a large pot of thick black coffee, and every time he has an asthma attack, have him drink as much as he possibly can. If he can't fall asleep, he can't have an attack. Now, my father had been reading, and they had something called asthma cigarettes. Another doctor recommended that, said it opens his airways. My father felt those were far too dainty, and so instead he would light up a very large cigar, and I was supposed to smoke that. You can imagine me with my cup of coffee in one paw and my cigar in the other. I was miserable. I was also given Epicac, but I'm not going to bring up that topic. Now, my father also was reading about something going on in Europe. They called it the taking of air. See, what they would do is they would take the children high up into the mountains. Now, it was impractical for my father to take me up into the Adirondacks, but he could hook up the carriage and take me out of the city into the wilderness. And we would get to the wilderness, and he would kick me out of the carriage, and he would say, Theodore, breathe. You know what? I did feel better. And while I was out there, I began to see the things that I had been reading about in my picture books. My goodness, there's a frog. Well, it immediately went into my pocket. And of course, if I was able to find a snake, if I was lucky enough, that went into my other pocket. By the time I got it back into the carriage, my pockets were moving. And then I had to get into my house and figure out how I was going to sneak them upstairs so that I could figure out what was in my picture book. Of course, I had to be very sneaky about it. Now, my father had decided that I had an interest in this, so instead he would go into the basement and bring up jars, and I was able to put my specimens in jars and label them with their scientific name. As a matter of fact, my father was so impressed with what I was doing that he even gave me taxidermy lessons from the very best taxidermist in all of New York City, Mr. Bell. And my grandfather gave me a small shotgun of French manufacture so that I could increase my collections. Soon my entire room was filled with formaldehyde and dead bodies. But you know, where I got my conservation was not just from those times outside with my father. They also came from my uncle. You see, my grandfather had built a row houses in New York for all of the family, and my next-door neighbor was my uncle, Robert B. Roosevelt. He was an angler. He loved to be out angling. But he noticed something. He noticed that every time that he went fishing, less and less fish were available to catch. And then he decided that he was going to try to figure out why. And so he went to Europe, and he learned that they were doing something in Europe called fish hatcheries. So he brought the concept back to the United States, and he is known as the father of the fishes, the very first fish hatcheries ever brought to the United States. So you see, the Roosevelt family has a long history of thinking forward, of conservation of our natural resources.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. Leopold, what events in your formative years shaped you as a conservationist?
Well, I have to say that I had a much easier childhood, I think, than these other two. But I grew up in Burlington, Iowa, and my grandfather, Charles Stucker, was a banker and an architect and pretty much one of the leading members of our town. And he had built a beautiful home, 3-story mansion on the banks of the Mississippi, and I can't imagine a more perfect setting for a young boy who really wanted to be a naturalist, who really wanted to learn about nature, because the Mississippi River was flowing right below us. Grandfather had planted lots of trees. In fact, with every birth in our family, he made sure that there was a tree planted on the Prospect Hill, is what it was called. I had a consistent record of being a little bit late for school every day because there were so many things to explore. We had ravines, we had little limestone caves, we had creeks, and my direct route was probably about 3 miles longer than it should have been because there was just so many things to enjoy. And my father, Carl, he was a sportsman, an avid sportsman, but he also had a sense of ethics, which he instilled in myself and my siblings. What he really would do is he had this respect for nature, even though he was a hunter. There were often times that we thought we were going out hunting, and Father wouldn't have his gun with him, and we would say, you know, are we hunting? And he's like, you all may, but I just feel like I want to just watch nature today. And so there was always that little bit of respect for nature where we actually got to enjoy it. We would sit, we would listen. One of the things that I have always remembered was the stories. He was a quiet teacher, and he would take us out to places that he knew there was something that he wanted us to learn. And it could be some new fresh tracks in the mud along the river bottom, or a punky log that had the top knocked off, and we're wondering what had done that. Or a flock of geese veering their way south. There were all these stories. And Father would take us out to these places and let us make the discoveries. And I've been a professor at University of Wisconsin now for about 13 years, and I have found that to be the best way to teach, is how he taught us. And it's to teach by giving the student the opportunity to make the discovery themselves, because then they remember it. It becomes part of them. Those experiences that I had in Burlington, and every summer in August, our family would travel to Les Chateaux Islands, which is on the north side of Lake Huron. And I remember as a child, I had read so many stories about the adventurers out west and in Kentucky and places, but Daniel Boone was one that I always was fascinated with. And so when we would go to Les Chateaux, those islands, I got to be Daniel Boone and explore and just be a young child that was just full of wonder and seeing what was out there. There were a lot of these moments that I think when I look back that really did shape how I looked upon the world, because I spent all my time outside. I started watching birds when I was, I think, 8 or 9. And I didn't have a pair of binoculars, but what I did have was my mother's opera glasses. And so I would go out and shake them out and do my observing. And I remember I kept my entire life pretty much a journal of the stories. Every day there seemed to be something that I would want to write down and remember. And I think I was 10 or 11 when I wrote that the wren was my favorite bird. And I had found 13 wren nests on our property. I was always just fascinated to see who was coming back and how many eggs they laid. And there was the stories, and they changed every year. So my childhood was full of times being out in nature. And I know that was a very strong foundation for me for my later years.
Thank you. Those stories bring back memories for me as a kid, too. Mr. President, I am curious. You are most well known for bringing conservation to the forefront, and I'm wondering what inspired you to devote your career to conservation?
An excellent question. You know, I started my first public schooling at Harvard University. You see, because of my childhood illness, I wasn't able to go to public school, and I told my parents later on that I had decided that I wanted to go to study to be a naturalist, and Harvard University had the very best school for it. So I studied German and natural history and zoology. But you see, all of my time that I had spent in my childhood dissecting those animals, I thought had well prepared me for the opportunity. I expected now that I was going to learn to be able to go out into habitats, to see animals in their natural habitats, to write down the stories of them. That's not what Harvard wanted me to do. They wanted me to be inside, to look at animals through a microscope, to prepare them for museum preparation. Well, of course, I was disappointed, but I took my time during after school, and I would go off to the Maine woods, and I would go off on hunts to collect specimens that I could bring back to school. And it was there that I recognized that there were less and less animals. Just as my uncle had learned about the fishes, I was seeing the exact same thing. Now, as president, I knew that I had an opportunity. My opportunity would be to have a bully pulpit, to alarm people about this concern. Now, I had written a book before I became president called Hunting Trips of a Ranchman. It was about my time out in the Dakotas. And while I was writing a story about my book, I had sent a copy to a man by the name of George Bird Grinnell, the #1 editor of a magazine called Forest and Stream. And I expected a very nice review of my magazine. However, it sort of, paraphrased, said, "I'm sure Roosevelt's a fine young man, but he doesn't know a darn thing about hunting the black-tailed deer." Well, I decided now that I was a cowboy, I knew how to solve that problem. All I had to do was go to New York and punch him in the nose. But you know, when I sat down with George Bird Grinnell, he began to describe all the things that I'd gotten wrong. And then he began to scold me. He said, "Roosevelt, your book is all about killing things. We should be preserving things, conserving things. Those mule deer that you were writing about, that you're massacring, our populations are down to less than 5,000 from 25 million. And of course, those bison, the most amazing creatures, I could see firsthand. The reason I had first gone out to the Dakotas was to get one. And when I had gotten off the train, they said, 'Mr. Roosevelt, there are no bison left.' They were right. I had to ride out to the edge of Montana before I saw one. I picked up my rifle and shot what I figured was the very last one." Grinnell reminded me that that was not conservation, that was tragedy. Well, he and I put our heads together and we created a special club. We called it the Boone and Crockett Club, after your famous friend, Mr. Daniel Boone. And the idea was that gentlemen hunters would take our time and we would define what animals needed to be protected, what animals we could take. And we would set an allotment that said, gentlemen hunters will not hunt any of these types of animals. It was a grand idea. Eventually, as I was out in the Maine woods, I would discover that all sorts of things were happening. You see, I would see woods that were cut down, that the topsoil would be flowing down into the rivers, eroding. It would block the creeks. It would end navigation. Those poor farmers that wanted to move their crops in and out had no way to. And the people that wanted to move their goods and services up and down the rivers could not. I, as a president, had an obligation to do something about it. It is vandalism to wantonly destruct anything which is beautiful in nature, whether it be a cliff or a tree or a mammal or a bird. There is nothing as beautiful as the Yosemite, nothing as grand as the canyon, nothing as beautiful as the Canyon of the Yellowstone, the Three Tetons. Our people should see to it these places are left unmarred. Oh, I can feel poor Muir here bristling as I say that, because as he knows, I had to make decisions from time to time that went against my principles. The Newlands Recreation Act of 1902 was a desire to be able to irrigate this beautiful land out west so that farmers had a way to grow crops. It also meant that we had to take some of those beautiful areas and build dams for water for other communities, as well as hydroelectric power. That's the hard decision of being a president. You have to look at the balance of everything. At times, I wanted it to be purely conservation, but conservation of our people is also important. All I ask of you is, of all the questions that come before our great nation, short of its preservation or war, there is none which compares to the great central task of leaving this land even a better land for our descendants than it is for us.
Thank you. Let's shift to you then, Mr. Muir. You're best known for probably your reverence of life and for promoting the preservation of wilderness. What motivated you, inspired you to spend an entire career devoted to preservation?
Well, I do believe that I have to point out something that has disturbed me for a number of years about your fascination with killing things, Mr. President. But I would just like to say that I, too, was a hunter when I was a boy, and I remember shooting a loon, and the loon was not killed. And so I brought the loon back to the house, and I nursed it back to health. And the loon became one of our family, and the cat did not like the loon. And I recall very distinctly that when the loon was in the basket, the cat came over and was about ready to put its paw on the loon. The loon held his head back further and further, and as the cat came forward, the loon suddenly shot out and hit the cat right in the head. The cat went running across the floor, up on the wall, and came down and began looking at the loon like, "Why did you do that?" I did kill 2 other animals in my life that I did kill out of purpose. They were 2 rattlesnakes, and I regretted it, for they did not attack me. I thought they were going to be dangerous, but they were doing their own thing, and I should have left them to do that. But I would say that one of the animals that affected me the most was a dog that I met up in Alaska when I went up with Hall Young, who was a Presbyterian minister. He had been given this dog called Stickeen, after the Stickeen Indians. Now, it wasn't much of a dog when I first saw it. In fact, we would go out in the boats and we'd go to explore the glaciers, and Stickeen would jump out of the boat and go swimming and go off to the land, and we'd call him, and he wouldn't come. And finally he'd come and come back out into the boat and then shake and get us all wet. He was kind of like a little fox, and he had hair that came down over his head, and he looked all disheveled when the wind blew in all the wrong direction. But one night, I was in the tent with the others when I heard a great storm coming. And so I thought to myself, this is no time to be staying inside. I must get out and see what nature is doing. And so I left the tent and was about to make my way out into the glacier, when all of a sudden I heard this pathetic little and I turned around, and there was Stickeen, and he came up to me, and he raised his little paw and went, And I said, "Stickeen, you must go back to your father. You must, this is no kind of weather for you to be out in." And he looked at me again and went, And so I reached into my pocket, and I pulled out some crumbs of bread, and I said, "Here's your breakfast, let's be off." And so began one of the most eventful days of my life. Well, I'll go through most of it as we were running across the glacier and jumping across crevasses. And finally, we came to a crevasse that was 50 feet across. And there was no way that we could go across there. And so I went backwards and realized that we had come down quite a large crevasse that was about 12 feet across, and there was no way that we could run and jump and get on the other side. And so I began looking frantically for another way across, and I finally came to a place where a snow bridge had sunk down 25 feet, went all the way across the 50-foot span and up on the other side. So I pulled out my ice axe and I began making steps. And I went down 25 feet, and then I shaved off the top of the ice bridge and scooched away over on the other side. But think of Stickeen. When he saw me go down, he came up to the edge of the glacier and looked down into the crevasse. And as he clear English, he said, "No, no, no," and went running off. And I said, "Stickeen, you must come now, for the snow is coming down harder, and I will freeze, and so will you. So you must come now, or otherwise all I can say is I'll come back in the morn and try to find you. But you must come now." And as if he understood every word he said, I said, he came up to the edge and put his paws right over the edge of the crevasse. And then I said, "Stickeen, you must come now." And his back legs came up, and he went down to the first step, and down to the next, and down to the next, until he was down to the ice bridge itself. And then he began making sure that every step would count, for if not, he would fall into the depth of the whole crevasse, and you could hear the water taking it beneath the glacier. and he made it across, all the way across to the other side. But then I thought, how is he possibly going to come up 25 feet of vertical ice? For dogs are not good climbers on ice. But he was looking at the wall as if every single move he made had to be so carefully done. And then all of a sudden, he took off and he went flying up the top of the glacier right to the very next to me. And then he went running off. And I said, Sakeen, you made it. And he came running back, and from 10 feet away, he leapt and hit me in the face, and we rolled and laughed. And I've never seen so much fear turn to so much joy. And it was through him as through a window of clarity. We are not alone in this world. We share this world with other mortal beings who fear and love and have joy. And we must remember that we are not alone.
Mr. Leopold, we'd like to hear from you. I think what you're probably best known for is developing the concept of the land ethic. So what inspired you to devote your entire career to conservation?
I think so much of it was really the early experiences that I had. But in 1909, I had gone to the forestry school in Yale and had graduated. But I always wanted to come out west. There was a mystique about the West that I wanted to experience. And I'm sure some of it was the cowboy portion of it, of just wanting to be out there in the wilds. And so when I first arrived, I was assigned to the Apache National Forest, which was in the Arizona Territory in 1909. And from pretty much the first day, what I found was something totally different than what I had been taught in school. What they taught us in school was all about using resources, livestock, harvesting timber, mining. It was all about using what was out there. But what I saw was the devastation that came from that type of thinking. And so very early, I started realizing that we had a very hard impact on the land. So that was, when I first went out, I was 22. I'm 60 now, and the writings that I've been doing lately, and I have a book that I just found out is going to be published called Great Possessions. And in it are a lot of my observations, and a lot of them have been gleaned from my writings and my memories. But the one thing, and I won't say that I always felt this way, it was rather an end result of my lifelong journey in thinking that we needed a different way of looking at how we approach our life. We had ethical behavior, but that didn't apply to the land, to the soils, the waters, the plants, and the animals. So I started thinking about a land ethic, where it wasn't just about commodity, about using something. In fact, the last word in ignorance is that of a man who says of a plant or an animal, what good is it? How does it benefit me? And I saw where that led. It led to overgrazing and clear cutting and pretty much the ruination of our lands. So what I propose with the land ethic is that we are not the conqueror of the land, but we are more a community member of the land community. And with that, needed to be respect for the land, for each other particularly, but also for the land and the animals and the plants. And as I said, that has been a lifelong journey, but I saw so many things that happened along the way. I saw so much devastation. One of the things that I remember as a child was the dark clouds of flocks of passenger pigeons. Have you all heard of the passenger pigeon? In 1850, there were roughly 3 billion passenger pigeons. In 1914, 64 years later, Martha, the last passenger pigeon, died in the Cincinnati Zoo. In 64 years, we wiped out the whole species, over 3 billion birds. There's so many examples like that, the buffalo being one of them. From the millions and millions of buffalo, by the late 1800s, there were only like 350 left. It's those types of examples where we thought of land as being commodity, something to use, and we thought it was endless. But with a land ethic, it became something that we needed to really study and to think about what our impact was on the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sad to say we've lost some species, Mr. Leopold, but others we have brought back to healthy numbers.
Like what?
We'll save that for later. How's that? Buffalo's one, right? Let's move on and talk about the kind of the popularity of your work. Not everybody loved what you were doing. Mr. Muir, can you share some of the obstacles and challenges you faced?
Well, I have to say that one of my most delightful moments in Yosemite was with Mr. President here. I remember waking up with a fresh layer of snow on our bags or our blankets that we had, and the others, they had stayed back in the cabins, if you remember.
It was bully fun, wasn't it?
It was great, and I remember actually going out and torching an old dead tree and watching it burn up, and it was quite fascinating. Even I enjoyed that. But I have to ask you, though, I hear that you go to Africa to kill big animals, and I don't understand this fascination with killing beautiful, large animals. Could you please explain how that is okay?
You know, I can understand why you have concerns. And let me put it in a different perspective for you. Imagine for a moment that you're a young child walking through a museum. When you see the most amazing, let's just use a Kodiak bear as an example, and you see this animal and you say, that is the most amazing thing that I have ever seen. We should preserve that animal. Africa was no different. You know, the Smithsonian Institute needed examples of certain animals, and I decided that I had the skills to bring one back. I could certainly preserve those animals so that they could be reassembled back in that museum in the very best way. It was a way to continue conservation, just in a different way than you think.
Well, I appreciate you. Actually, I've never thought of a preservationist as somebody who puts an animal in a bottle and preserves it. That's a different way of preserving.
I can understand your concerns,
Yeah.
and I do respect you, as you know.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's move on to you, Mr. Leopold. What were some of the obstacles you faced in your work in conservation? I'm guessing there were a few.
Mainly, I would say the wall of ignorance. As a child, in my writings, one of the ways that I found to continue my own education was through observing, to question things, to not just go through life, but to actually stop and pay attention. And as I learned more, I realized that most of the people around me did not do that. They didn't observe. And so they didn't know the same stories. They didn't feel the same things that I was feeling in the depth that I felt because they didn't pay attention. It's trying to get people to slow down enough to where they can actually be a community member, where they can actually pay attention to what's happening to everything else around us. And you can't do that when you are flying through life. You have to pause. You're not paying attention to things, so you don't understand things. How can you write good policy if you don't know enough about your subject? It's folly. That's one reason why I really worked on setting aside our wild lands for wilderness, was because it gave us an opportunity to study those lands in a way that we would begin to understand them, because then we could treat them with respect and love. Otherwise, it was just something to harvest. So, ignorance was my biggest wall.
Thank you for that. Now, Mr. President, I'm pretty sure, if memory serves me, you had a few obstacles, a few people that pushed back on your work in conservation. Can you share a bit about a few of those?
Absolutely. Well, I would say that my very first obstacle was Congress. I suppose I should add big business to that as well. You know, we always say about our senators, you know, the business people make a large investment in them. So in the morning when they do roll call, they don't know whether to say present or not guilty. But you know, as my earliest memory of being president was you ladies in your hats. You know, you mentioned the passenger pigeon. I remember large flocks of those, amazing birds. You see, ladies' hats. There were 5 million birds a year being murdered to make ladies' hats. The Ornithological Society, along with the Audubon Society, came to me and said, Mr. President, you've got to do something. And I said, my hands are tied. I don't know what I can do. They were all concerned about the Land Act land, that somebody would move in and take over many of the places that these innocent little birds were raising their young. Well, Attorney General Knox said, Mr. President, I think you can set aside pieces of land that are significant. And I said, if that's true, I so declare it. And we created the first wild bird sanctuary off the coast of Florida, Pelican Island. 3 small acres to save the pelican. It was a grand idea. People across the United States were sending me notes telling me that they had a place just like it. And I created 51 wild bird sanctuaries all across our great country. Now, many people credit me for creating the national parks. I didn't. The first national park was, of course, Yellowstone, created in 1872 by Congress, because they can only be created by Congress, and supported, of course, by our president, Mr. Grant. And, of course, you know why that park was created, because the business people had an influence in it. That train needed to go somewhere. And Scribners had been writing about this place that had things called geysers. They didn't even understand them. They would draw pictures of them flowing sideways, like waterfalls. But you know, Hill was smart. He decided that if he had a destination for his train, and if he had the United States government marketing for him, he was going to be busy. And he was right. But you see, what Congress can create, Congress can take away. Our second national park, I'm sure you've all been to. You remember it? Oh, no, you probably don't, because 20 years later it was removed. Mackinac Island National Park. You see, what Congress can create, Congress can take away. But when I became president, I decided that since my popular ideas of these birds was working, I was going to go back to Congress and I was going to recommend we make more national parks. And at first, the congressmen were very excited, and we did. We more than doubled the number of our national parks. But let me tell you, those business people were getting very nervous about the gobbling up of that land. See, they saw that as their resource. And so when I went back to ask for more, they said, no, Mr. President, that's enough. There was this amazing place in Arizona. I couldn't imagine it not being preserved. So when I went to the people that represented the Arizona territory, they said, I'm sorry, Mr. President, that land is spoken for. They're already beginning to move in steam shovels. They're going to go dig it out. As a matter of fact, they're poking holes in the side right now to see what kind of gold and silver they might find. I didn't know what to do. And I began to think, perhaps if I used that same skill set that I had used to save the birds, I could use it to save land. Now, the rule was very simple. I, as president, was going to use executive privilege, of course, within the constitutional rights, to say what I could do. And it was going to be the smallest property possible to save the antiquities or elements within. Now, I had to go to Congress and convince them. I'd already asked to save that piece of land, and they had already told me no. So I went and talked about a big tower out in Wyoming that no one cared about. Devil's Tower. Go ahead, Theodore, do whatever you want. That sounds like a bully good idea. So I did, and I wrote the legislation called the National Monuments and Antiquities Act. And then the next thing that I saved was 800,000 acres, the Grand Canyon. As I was completing the paperwork, I said this. In the Grand Canyon, Arizona has one of the most amazing elements in the entire natural world. Man cannot improve upon it. I hope that they do not add any buildings, no summer cottages, no hotels, nothing that could be seen from that amazing rim. The ages have worked on it. Man can only mar it. Now, yes.
I came a little over 10 years after President Roosevelt had been out there. And one of my first jobs with the Forest Service was to actually look at what was happening to the Grand Canyon because they did not listen to you. We couldn't see the Grand Canyon. There were vendors. There was no sanitation. It was a disaster. So that was the first thing that we worked on, was to come up with a recreational plan that cleaned it up. So your words were correct, but they were not listened to.
Well, I'll have to add that to Congress as my list. Now, as we're speaking about those land barons, I imagine that we have to finish up with what you just spoke about, the Forest Service. You see, because I was using the edge of the rules within the constitutional allowance, let me understand that and make sure that's clear. I was setting aside forests. You see, in 1891, they had created something called the Forest Reserve Act that had allowed presidents to do such a thing. And they had taken the low-hanging fruit, 50 million acres. But as I looked to the west, I realized that there were many large parcels of forest that I could preserve. And so myself, along with Mr. Gifford Pinchot, began to write legislation and write more and more places that we preserved. We got to the point where Congress had had enough of me. And they decided that what they were going to do is they were going to write a bill, and they were going to include forest land, forest property for the 6 farthest western states where I would not be allowed to take any of their forests. They knew that I had to sign this bill because there were many things in there that were critical to the operation of the United States. So Mr. Gifford and I put our heads together. And 2 hours before that bill was to become law, we set aside 16 million acres in the Pacific Northwest, called the Midnight Reserves. Needless to say, Congress still doesn't talk to me. But I want to remind you that these are important things. Public lands are your lands. They're not the land barons' lands. You don't want to have the people making decisions about your land based on the fact that they need higher profits to fund their yachts. You want public lands because they benefit you. And you are the very best stewards of public lands, the ones who should be looking towards the future, thinking about what your children's children need to enjoy just as you have. Bless you all for being Americans, and most of all, bless you for continuing the hard work of these 2 men.
Thank you all. I appreciate the courage and tenacity it took for you all to stand up for these resources. Thanks to you, our grandchildren, my grandchildren, will enjoy these special places. I want to turn over the questioning to you all now, give you an opportunity. You didn't always get an opportunity to rub shoulders with one another. So, Mr. Muir, would you like to ask a question of anyone?
Well, I would like to just make a little comment about that person that you referred to, Gifford Pinchot. He was quite a young upstart when I first met him. I was at the Grand Canyon, you were not there, but no. I encouraged him to come out and camp along the rim with me. And I woke up in the morning and I said, "Giff, get up. Let's stand on our heads and watch the sunrise upside down." we got along quite well, but years later, I did run into him up in the Northwest. And I have to say, I was rather disturbed because even though I thought they were going to preserve the land, it was not preservation. He advocated the best use for the most number of people, and that included sheep. Now, I've tended many sheep in my life, but I would rather refer to them as hoofed locusts, especially when they're devouring our alpine environments, which is where our water sources come from. We cannot have sheep and water in the same place and understand that we can still drink the water after the sheep have shat in it. And so I think we need to be careful about what we assume is the commodification of nature as being a good thing. And I would like to just leave it off as any fool can destroy a tree. They cannot run away, and if they could, they would still be chased and hunted as long as fun or a dollar could be got out of their bark, their hide, their spreading horned branches, and few that fell trees ever plant them. Nor would planting avail anything like the noble forests that once graced our land. It took 3,000 years to grow some of our trees in our western woods, trees that are still standing in perfect strength and beauty. Since all the eventful centuries since Christ's time and long before that, God has cared for those trees, saved them from drought, disease, avalanche, and 1,000 straining tempests and floods. But he cannot save them from fools. Only you can do that. So please, help us save the trees.
Mr. Muir, was there a question in there for one of your panel members?
I suppose my question is really about, is it about conservation or preservation? Because to me, I don't think we can have both in the same place. And so what are your thoughts about that?
Well, you bring up a valid point, but when you and I were out on our camp, we had this discussion over the fire.
Yes, we did.
Now, I will tell you that conservation is not preservation. It's a form of preservation, but it's a fundamental use of resources in the beneficial way, in the most beneficial way. And I have to look at this as a president, not as a person that can spend all of his time in the woods. I have to look at all of the grand things going on in our country. You know, a good example of this is the damming of Hetahetchee.
Yes.
Of course, we just had a large earthquake happen in San Francisco. The darn town burned to the ground, and we needed to find water for those poor people. We also needed to find a way to produce electricity so that we could have power going to these people as well. Now, obviously, I would have loved to preserve that. But I could conserve other areas of your majestic Yosemite and still have the resources for my
I
people.
only ask you, why did it have to be put into a national park? There were other places it could have gone.
At the time, sir, it made the most sense.
Well,
And I think that's important to point out about conservation as well. Sometimes you make a decision that you have to do at the moment that you wished you would have done elsewhere. I heard something about a heaven tree here that apparently was not any kind of natural thing that existed here. They added it in here because they thought it was going to be beneficial. Isn't that true?
Yes, it is.
All right.
Mr. Leopold, do you have a question for one of the panel members?
Well, I find myself more in the middle between a conservationist and a preservationist. I am fortunate in that I have been able to read the writings of both of you and have benefited greatly from that. I think the one question I would have for both of you, how do you judge when something is better? Is it more beneficial for humans or more beneficial for the land? And how do you make that decision?
You bring up a very valid point. As a president, there are many difficult decisions that you have to make. And I have to think about my country. I believe that I am the father of our country. I want to pass on to our next generation the country improved and not impaired. But it's important that if you are to preach to children, you must act in a way that you preach. I had to decide at times that I was going to do things that were to the benefit of people over animals. And at times, I believe that, quite honestly, by preserving things, we were benefiting the people. The national parks is a perfect example. The more time that people could spend in nature, as I had when I was a young child trying to fight for air, the better off I was. I think it's a balance in the best way possible to use both.
Well, I would just like to add that I think we need to expand our considerations to more than humans and realize that there are societies of animals, the bear society, the deer society, the tree society, and realize that we're all on this earth together and one cannot live without the other. And so I feel we do need both, but I don't feel like our commodification of nature is going in the right direction.
I would like to add that I feel like I grew up as a conservationist. But as I experienced more of the world, the natural world, I realized that if things were just left to mankind, that we weren't going to have any more wild lands. And there was that responsibility. So in that way, I became more of a preservationist because we needed to retain what wild lands we still had because they were disappearing so rapidly. In 1900, there were roughly 800 cars and trucks in the United States. The number of vehicles by 1930, so in 30 years' time, was 23 million. There were hardly any roads, paved roads particularly, in 1900. In 1930, the drivers drove more than 1 billion miles. What that meant was that there were vehicles going into our wild lands. Often they didn't come back out, but they were getting into and taking people to places that they had not been before. And we were losing our land so quickly. So that was when we really pushed to set aside some of our wild lands. And it was mainly because we were going to lose it. And if we didn't have it to study and to learn from, we weren't going to be able to manage. And so that's why we really pushed for the wilderness areas. I think this blend of a preservationist and a conservationist, as Mr. President said, you have to make that decision, but you can't do it in a blanket decision. You have to look at everything individually and think about the impact that we have. So please, I ask of you as well to think as you go through your day about what your decisions, the impact that they have on not just our native or wild lands, but also on each other. Thank you.
I do have a quick question for you. You know, I wrote you a note. I'm sure you hopefully received it, where I complimented you on your preservation of big game. Whatever became of that?
I still have it framed on my wall. It was one of the most touching things that I have ever received. And it meant a lot to me because I had been working in New Mexico and Arizona on what we were calling game protection associations. Most of the hunting lands and angler lands were tied up by wealthy people. And the folks who we really needed to rely on hunting for food on their table were not able to. And so we formed these GPAs, Game Protective Associations, to give the smaller hunters and anglers a voice. And we did. We formed these associations throughout Arizona and New Mexico, which have now become the wildlife federations. But we did. We became a political power. And it was because of that that I received this letter from President Roosevelt that meant so much to me because it meant like we actually were accomplishing something, because if we didn't have a strong voice, you probably wouldn't have heard it.
Bully for you.
Well, gentlemen, we want to leave a little time for this fine audience to ask questions, but I do have a final question, and we'll start with you, Mr. Leopold. I'm curious about what you'd like to see happen in the future of environmental conservation.
I touched upon being more observant. And I know just recently I spoke to Estella, my wife, because she had asked me, with all the students that I had and all the talks that I had been given, what it was that would mean the most to me for people to do. And what I told her was kind of what I have said earlier. Of all those things, if people just became more observant, if they would pause and actually pay attention to what was going on around them, and think about it, question it, don't take things for granted. And that means studying things. That means investing a little time, which when you respect something, that's what you need to do. So please, be more observant and don't just take somebody else's word for it. Make your own decision, which takes a little more time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. President, the same question to you. What do you hope for the future of conservation?
You know what I say is that we have grown heirs to the most lucky country in the entire world. But you know, each of us must do our part if we are to show the nation that we are worthy of our good fortune. We must continue to expand what we have already worked so hard to protect. That we need to build more public lands and protect more public lands. That we need to teach our children to enjoy them and have them set aside for their children and their children's children. We are a fortunate people. But the number one question always has been, what do we do to protect our resources? It is the fundamental question, and we will not survive unless we solve it. Thank you.
Very good. And Mr. Muir, you were focused on preservation, so what are your hopes for the future of environmental preservation?
Well, I think the president took the words out of my mouth, and that is that we need to educate the children. The children are our future, and they need to have experiences being with animals and being out in the country, exploring, discovering, and learning about the trees, and perhaps planting a tree and caring for it. Because it is through caring that one discovers that we have an important responsibility, that we all need to be stewards of the land and stewards of the life that depends on it. And I think that all of us are in agreement on that.
All very well said. I hope that all of you in the audience will think about what you can do, what each of us can do. If you look on the back of your program, there's a prompting question for you in that last paragraph. So please, as you go home, contemplate that. Okay, so we've got about 20 minutes for audience questions. So if we could bring up the house lights, I'll go ahead and take any questions you might have for our panel members, and let's focus on environmental conservation and preservation with these folks. Yes. Thank you for that. The question, if I can boil it down, is what would you think of a constitutional amendment for protection of our natural resources in the environment? Mr. President, this seems appropriate for you.
Goodness.
You're the one who's dealt with Congress.
I have. You know, I will tell you that the Constitution is a very delicate document. It's one that we should not play with. And I agree with everything that you have just said, that our air and our water, as well as everything else about that, is a valid point. But what is our scope of it? Is it the entire country and we stop development for everything? Then we have an impact of jobs. Now, I don't disagree with what you're saying. Please don't listen to me and say that I'm for big business. I am certainly not. But what I'm questioning is what the future looks like. How do we scope something so large and put it into a package that makes sense so that Congress, as well as the states, can embrace it? It's a very difficult question. It's a wonderful challenge, and I would love for somebody to take it on. I am afraid I am too old. But I do appreciate your enthusiasm for it, and I embrace you to continue your fight. You know, what I always say is it is not the critic who counts. We can sit here in a room and talk about how everything should be better, but it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbled or the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, for there is no effort without error or shortcoming. But he or she who strives to do the deeds, who knows the great devotions, who spends themselves to a worthy cause, who if in the end they are successful, knows the triumph of high achievement. But if they failed, at least they failed while daring greatly, so that their place is never with those cold and timid souls that knew neither victory nor defeat.
So eloquently said. And may I add, for a gentleman of 130-ish plus years, you look fabulous. More questions? Yes, in the back. Mr. Muir, the question is, given the dramatic change in our glaciers in this country, how much they've melted, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, your description is very alarming. I can't imagine what it looks like now compared to when I saw it. I traveled the world after I retired from writing and got to go to all 7 continents. And I specifically recall the glaciers of Norway and also the glaciers of Switzerland and even the Antarctic. And I believe that we have to understand that we're really quite little compared to the processes that are going on around us. And we should be humbled by that and realize that we can be stewards, but we have to understand the processes better. And that comes with science, and that comes with learning, and that comes with appreciating that change is part of the world, but is it a change that is going in the right direction?
Are there any other thoughts on the panel about this question?
Observing, like you mentioned, is critical, because if somebody, we call it a sense of place, if somebody arrives at Glacier Bay today and they see it the way it is now and they know not the history, then they're going to think that that's the way it always was. But when you look at the pictures from Captain Cook's expedition, you realize that something has changed. And so it's realizing that things are not the same and then trying to find out why they're not the same. That's science. I mean, that's when we actually start to come up with solutions, because then you recognize that there's a problem. If you only go to a place one time, you don't have that opportunity to compare. So the observation is critical. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, please. Thank you for that. There's today there is some controversy still with Mexican gray wolf, and this gentleman is interested in hearing your perspective on that, Mr. Leopold.
I wrote a story that is in my book, Great Possessions, and I titled it Thinking Like a Mountain. Have you had a chance to read that?
I have it memorized.
I think that's a good thing. In 1909, when that story happened, I was 22 years old, and we were all hunters. We saw wolves as being competition for game. And we thought fewer wolves meant more deer, and that no wolves was a hunter's paradise. Over the years, I saw things that made me realize that I had erred in my thinking. One of the first times was thanks to President Roosevelt, when he set aside the Grand Canyon Preserve, we watched an area that had healthily sustained a population of deer of around 4,000. In 25 years, the population there, after we pulled the cows out and we had already eliminated most of the predators, in 25 years, that population had gone from 4,000 deer to around 70,000. So the same land that was sustaining 4,000 deer was asked to sustain 70,000. You can imagine what happened. They died of their own too much. They crashed. So that was one of the first really strong lessons that I had. And eventually I started thinking about with the community and how the predators were not something to think of differently, of individually. They had a tremendously powerful reason for being in the ecology, and we needed to respect that. They had a role to play. And I talk about cogs and wheels and how important it is, every one of them. And the predators, like the wolf, was a tremendous cog that we had yanked out. And we upset the whole ecological balance by doing that. I realized when I wrote that story, Thinking Like a Mountain, that it didn't make that much of an impact on me when I was 22. But when I went back through my writings and I realized what I had done and been part of, because I was, and I hate to say this, but I was one of the leading proponents of predator control. I learned that I was wrong. And one of the biggest problems is convincing the people around me that they were wrong too. And that has been, speaking of obstacles, that was a major one.
Thank you. Great question. Any other questions? Yes, please. So in terms of our wilderness areas, and we have the first wilderness area in the world here in New Mexico, the Gila Wilderness, just celebrated 100th anniversary. Thank you, Mr. Leopold. And the question is, do we celebrate that enough? Do we take advantage of that as a valuable resource in tourism, et cetera?
Well, first off, I have to say that makes me feel quite old to think that we're celebrating 100 years of something I accomplished. One of the biggest obstacles that I realized we were facing with setting aside wild lands was that if you bring people to be aware of the wild lands and to appreciate them, then that means that they are going out and they are enjoying them, they're seeing them. And as soon as you do that, it becomes less wild. And so there's that balance of how do you maintain wilderness? And so if we thought hard about this, it's like if we really promote people going out and visiting these areas, what was the impact going to be? And so one of the things that I really tried to do was to teach respect. If you are going to go to some of these places, go there with respect. Be as light on the land as you possibly can, and to appreciate it, to observe it. I think we can, but it really is that tool of teaching respect that is lacking in so much of our society. In fact, one of the things I recently wrote was, be it as may, our bigger and better society is much like a hypochondriac. They are so obsessed with their own economic health as to have lost the capacity to remain healthy. And there's nothing could be more solitary at this point than to purge ourselves of this plethora of material blessings. We tend to think of all these possessions instead of actually respecting what is already there.
I'd be curious to hear from Mr. President and Mr. Muir on this topic. It's a tricky one. In the Forest Service, we were constantly thinking about how do we educate people, how do we market, if you will, celebrate these special places so that people understand they need to be protected into the future, and at the same time balance not loving these places to death. Mr. Muir?
Well, thank you for bringing that up, because I feel like I advocated for wilderness as well, and yet what I heard in all the groups, including the Park Service and the Forest Service, is that it's primarily for people to go out and recreate. And I would just offer that maybe we need to exhibit a little bit more humility and realize that wilderness does not have to be only for humans to go recreate, but it's for those beings that need wild places to survive. And are we willing to let go of us having to go to all these places just because we want to experience them ourselves? Can we learn to let be and let nature have its own space and time?
Mr. President?
I commend you very much for that thought. I agree with you. But I also agree that in order for our public lands to continue to grow, people do need to see them, that they need to embrace them and to tell other people about them. That means that we have to set aside a certain piece of these wildernesses as places that people can visit. You know, Old Faithful being a perfect example. When that poor Old Faithful was first put in, you know, you took the train out to go see it, and they handed you a little hammer, and you took off a piece of it and took it home with you. Now, of course, that does not make sense. Today, I hope they have removed that barrier and people continue to enjoy it. But at least to have these places that people can't see any other way. And again, the overall grandness of the Yosemite or Yellowstone or all those places, many of those places people do not see. They only see those small things that are highlighted for them, and I think that does protect most of the wilderness that exists in it. But we have to have ways for people to tell what they saw and how important it was for them to see it, and that you must see it too.
Thank you. Well, we have time for one more question. Sorry, I saw the hand in the back first. So, and I will say that these gentlemen are willing to take one-on-one questions after the panel discussion ends, so feel free to come up and chat with them. But the woman in the back. So what are your thoughts on grazing on public land and balancing that with the needs of wildlife, sustainable wildlife populations?
Is that to me?
Sure.
I probably spoke more about that. First off, one thing I will say is that the stockman needs to realize that grazing their livestock on public lands is not a right, it's a privilege. And with that privilege comes a responsibility to treat that land, the public lands, with love and respect. And that is not something that we've been seeing very much. In my travels, when I was assistant forester in 1919 through 1924, I visited all 11 forests that were in Arizona and New Mexico. And two forests particularly, the Prescott and the Carson, but showed great signs of overgrazing. And the result of that was tremendous erosion and loss of our grasslands. It created what I consider to be sick land. It didn't have a chance to renew itself. So I mentioned earlier about the wolf. I mean, the wolf is part of that balance. You know, originally we thought the hunters were going to be able to handle the large number of deer that we saved because of taking the wolves out, but that doesn't work that way, and is not. The wolves are part of the whole ecology that needs to be there to have a healthy land. Do we do it haphazardly? No. It needs to be observed. It needs to be done carefully. But we need to have respect for the whole. And it's not just the individual ranchers that have, some losses because of the wolves. We need to talk about that. We need to think about how to do that in a way that honors the wolf along with the other inhabitants of the land.
I would just like to offer that the land that I came from in Scotland was transfigured and despoiled by sheep. And it resulted in not only the loss of the Caledonian forests of Scotland, but also the clearances of the people of Ireland and Scotland, because sheep were viewed as being more valuable than people. And I think that we need to keep things in balance.
Mr. President, did you have a quick thought on this before we wrap up?
I don't know if this is going to be a popular statement.
Go ahead.
I was in charge. I was the head of the Stockmen's Association for the Dakotas in Montana when I was a young man. And I will tell you that most of the ranchmen that I knew were decent human beings. Now, there were a few scoundrels. And I can imagine that the scoundrels, if given the opportunity, would take every advantage of anything that the government would provide them. So I would imagine that the best thing is to monitor the scoundrels and to perhaps save the land as best we can. It's a balancing act. When I first went out to the Dakotas, the ranchmen were moving into it because the bison were being moved off. All the ranchmen convinced me to invest in cattle because they said, those big bison are finally gone. Now we can use our cattle to graze here. I thought I was going to make a fortune. Of course, in 1886, with the blizzard that came through, half of my cattle were wiped out, as well as most of the ranchmen of the area. It was a difficult time, so I understand the side of the ranchman as well as I understand the conservationist.
Thank you for that. So many of these topics we could dive into for, days. So thank you for your insightful questions. As we finish up our time here today, I wanted to be sure and give a huge shout out to the Humanities Council. I can't imagine New Mexico without these programs, unfortunately. We're going to have to imagine that. I feel so privileged to have been part of this last presentation. New Mexico Humanities Council has been with us for 50 years. So thank you for the amazing programs that you've brought to us. They've meant so much, have been so good for us. Second, I want to thank our esteemed panel members. You were fabulous.
I think it's nap time, though, isn't it? Is it nap time?
Yeah, these old guys need a nap here. Before I close, though, I think Mr. Leopold had something for you.
Well, actually, I'll become Steve Morgan here. What we did today, we call it a Chautauqua, or living history. And I think all three of us would agree that it is one of the most exciting ways to teach history. And unfortunately, we are three old geezers up here. And currently, according to Aldo Leopold's biographer, I am the only Chautauqua performer of Leopold in the United States. There are a lot of people that give talks, but not in character. And that saddens me greatly because, I would love to pass on what I know. And the same thing with these two, too. But what we would like to know is there anybody out here who would be interested in learning a historical character? And you don't have to do an hour program. You could do a 10-minute program, but it's an opportunity to take somebody who has historical significance, somebody who has stories that should be told, but are often not. So if there's anybody who's interested in pursuing that, it doesn't have to be these three characters by any means. There's so many different people, particularly in New Mexico, but all over. Like a dear friend of mine is a doctor who's retiring, and he's like, do you think I could do Hippocrates? Or he wanted to wear a toga so he could become the first doctor. You know, it's like, yes, you know. Anybody who interests you in history, but when you become these people, when you take that role on, you embody it, but it also brings it to life to whoever is listening to you. So we really appreciate you all coming out here today to allow us to do that. But if there is somebody here who is interested in perhaps trying this, please come and talk to us afterwards.
Especially women's role.
Thank you so much, everyone. Go forth and do good things.